The monsoon in the Namkwin Valley did not simply fall. It arrived as a suffocating vertical ocean that turned the world into a grey-green blur. In May 1944, inside the defensive block known as Blackpool, the sound of the rain was a constant drumming hiss against the mud. That sound was punctuated only by the rhythmic, terrifying crump of Japanese 105mm and 155mm heavy artillery. This was a sound the men were never supposed to hear. They were light penetration forces, designed for hit-and-run raids. Yet here they were, anchored to a ridgeline, absorbing the kind of industrial-scale bombardment usually reserved for the Western Front. The mud in the slit trenches was a thick, viscous slurry, smelling of cordite, unwashed bodies, and the sweet, heavy stench of death rising from shallow, waterlogged graves. Masters looked out over the perimeter and saw what he could only describe as foundered beasts. These were men who had long since passed the 80-day threshold of human endurance. Their eyes were hollowed out, fixed in the vacant stare of the shell-shocked frames. Their uniforms were rotting off their skeletal frames. On the improvised runway, the charred skeletal remains of a C-47 transport plane sat as a silent monument to their isolation. The anti-aircraft guns had been silenced. With them, the umbilical cord of air supply was being severed in real time. The hold at all costs order, issued from distant, dry headquarters, had transitioned from a tactical directive into a collective death sentence. But to understand this mud-choked nightmare, we must look back a decade earlier, to a world that felt as distant as another planet. The road to this jungle slaughter began in the twilight days of the 1930s on the northwest frontier. In the remote outpost of Lorelei, the officer class inhabited a reality defined not by mechanized warfare, but by a rigid, performative etiquette. This was the old Indian Army. It was a ceremonial relic of the Victorian era, where the social hierarchy was as fixed as the stars. Evenings were spent in the country club atmosphere of Quetta, amidst the rustle of satin dresses and the light-hearted absurdity of charades. The elite maintained a secret hedonism that belied their rigid moral codes, finding refuge in the social rituals of the mess life while the freezing wind bit through their parade ground uniforms. At that time, the road past Mandalay was merely a metaphor for a career path. It was a steady climb through the ranks of an imperial policing force. Men like Willie Wellens, a complex Edwardian relic, navigated a world of polo matches and frontier skirmishes that felt more like a sport than a struggle for survival. The social divide between the officers was the bedrock of their existence, a structure that seemed unshakable. However, as the calendar turned towards September 1939, that traditional world began to erode. The uncommitted atmosphere of peacetime maneuvers was about to be shattered by a global conflagration that demanded a grueling maturation. The transition from the neat set-piece battle of the training manuals to the visceral terror of modern warfare would force these men to confront the end of their era. The country club was closing. The Indian Army was about to be forged anew in a fire that would consume the old colonial myths, leaving behind only the cold, professional reality of the soldier. The transition from the etiquette of the officer's mess to the visceral reality of combat arrived with the suddenness of a gunshot on April 1, 1941. In Baghdad, a pro-Nazi coup threatened the oil-slick jugular of the empire. The Gurkhas were abruptly vomited into a theatre that would become known as the Action West Campaign. The deployment to Basra was a military enema, a crude and necessary purging of peacetime illusions. As the troopships groaned into the river, the men were met not with imperial glory, but with a sensory assault that defied every romanticized image of the Orient. Basra was a landscape of rotting garbage and dead donkeys bloating in the canals. The heat was so absolute it felt like a physical weight. Below decks, in the airless engine rooms, temperatures soared to a lethal 149 degrees Fahrenheit. On the surface, the afternoon sun hammered the mercury past 120. Men suffered the delirium of heat stroke, their bodies so dehydrated they were physically unable to urinate. They survived on a near nausea-inducing diet of dates. This grueling environment exposed a widening chasm between the professional soldier and the aristocratic amateur. While the Gurkhas hunted enemy boats in the murky, mosquito-ridden creeks, the leadership at the top seemed to be fighting a different war entirely. One general's primary operational concern appeared to be the maintenance of his foxhounds and the chilling of his champagne. It was a detached command style that left his troops to rot in the squalor of the marshes. The colonels back at headquarters sent reports claiming their units were in fine fettle, while the reality was a logistical breakdown of catastrophic proportions. Mortars intended for the Indian troops had been foolishly diverted elsewhere, leaving the frontline battalions dangerously under-equipped as they faced the writhings of a demented insurgency. The psychological pivot for the entire force occurred not on a battlefield but inside the suffocating corrugated iron shell of an airfield hangar. As the troops gathered, their uniforms stained with the salt of evaporated sweat, General Bill Slim stood before them. The atmosphere was heavy with an uncommitted air. To many, the war still felt like a lark, a colonial policing action where one might sing German anthems in a bar for a laugh. But as Slim began to speak, a judicial hush fell over the hangar. He did not offer the hollow, Edwardian platitudes of the past. Instead, he stripped away the glamour of the uniform to reveal the solitary professional objective. He introduced a new vocabulary for the conflict, defining the enemy simply as the Dushman. In that moment, the war ceased to be a social engagement. It became a grim, technical necessity. The men realized they were no longer part of a ceremonial relic. They were the single fine point upon which the entire weight of the Middle Eastern theatre rested. By June 1941, the campaign shifted into the rolling brown grass sea of the desert as the Indian Division pushed into Syria. This was a war of inanimate poker players. Commanders led night marches across featureless plains toward Tel Abyad, relying on instinct and compasses under a gauzy curtain of moonlight. Their maps were nothing more than blank spaces. The advance was a logistical nightmare, where every gallon of fuel was stripped from support vehicles to keep the armoured sweep moving through the furnace wind. The soldiers marched through a crust of dust and tears. Their feet crunched the jelly of millions of crushed insects. Their throats were parched by chlorinated water that carried the constant, lurking threat of dysentery. In the blinding glare of the Syrian desert, grand strategy dissolved into the desperate intuition of a few isolated men. At places like Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, the conflict was managed by small groups of officers negotiating with local schoolmasters and tribal leaders in the harsh yellow shade. It was a theatre of the absurd. On the Persian border, a line of battered 3-ton trucks served as a hollow decoy, while high above, the American-built Martin, Maryland bombers appeared as silver arrows in the ancient sky. These silver arrows shattered the silence of the valleys with a multitudinous shriek. At the Battle of Deir ez-Zor, the slow plod toward the enemy line under the fire of French 75mm field guns finally broke the last vestiges of the peacetime soldier. Amidst the sharp, clean smell of cordite and the stomach-turning stench of uncleaned latrines, the men found themselves wrestling like characters in a tragedy with the administrative torture of the dead and the missing. The comfortable country club life of Quetta was now a ghost. It was replaced by the visceral reality of burying one's face in the burning sand as the desert transformed into a grueling green nightmare of survival. But the visceral reality of the front line was about to be replaced by a different, colder kind of terror. In February 1942, the maturing field officers were hit with a 20,000-volt shock to the nervous system. They were pulled from the mud and sent to the high-pressure corridors of the Staff College at Quetta. For these men, the war was no longer a series of isolated skirmishes. It had become an inverted pyramid, a massive teetering structure of men and munitions balanced precariously on the single fine point of a staff officer's precision. This was the era of the staff migraine. It was a physical companion, a throbbing pressure behind the eyes born from the realization that a misplaced decimal point in a transport ledger could starve an entire battalion in a mountain pass. The old social atmosphere had been scoured away by the biting Kojak wind. It was replaced by a monastic devotion to the staff manual and a sea of color-coded papers. There was white paper for the flawed theories of the classroom and green paper for the tentative guidance of the field. Then there was the dreaded pink paper, the correct answer, which mocked every subjective intuition an officer possessed. This grueling maturation reached its breaking point during the wargame simulations. In these exercises, the chaotic friction of 60 minutes of frontline combat was compressed into 10 minutes of frantic, silent staff work. Inside the drafty, dimly lit briefing room, the air grew thick with the smell of stale tobacco and the sharp metallic tang of nervous sweat. The clock was the primary enemy. Map cases were slapped onto tables with a sound like pistol shots as officers wrestled with the mental gymnastics of the syllabus. Their fingers cramped as they scribbled orders in standardized abbreviations. praying the instructions were clear enough to drop like tumblers into the mind of a sleep-deprived subaltern shivering in a hole in the ground. The officer found himself leading a mock brigade through a night attack, his mind a whirlwind of tables of organization and equipment. He felt the weight of the staff migraine intensifying as he calculated the 20,127 pounds of daily rations required for 6,709 men. His pencil lead snapped under the pressure of coordinating a motorized sweep across a rolling brown grass sea that existed only on a map. He moved with an opinionated confidence, a residue of his time in the desert, drafting a bold maneuver that prioritized speed over the dull minutiae of signal discipline. But could a plan built on speed survive the scrutiny of a master? The silence that followed the submission of his plan was shattered by the arrival of the commandant, Jeff Evans. Evans did not walk. He prowled the room like a god of minutiae whose eyes could deconstruct every map overlay with a single glance. When he reached the officer's desk, he did not offer a critique. He performed a public autopsy. The assessment was pitch black and clinical. Evans pointed a blunt finger at a missing detail in the signal annex, a failure to account for the charging cycles of the number 19 radio sets during the rapid advance. "You have achieved a magnificent tactical breakthrough on paper," Evans remarked, his voice like a dry, rasping saw. "But you have simultaneously ensured that not a single word of command will reach your forward companies for the next 6 hours. You have won the battle and murdered your men through simple, arrogant neglect." The officer watched as his military virtues were scattered like confetti across the page, the red ink of the corrections bleeding into his map like the casualties he had just theoretically caused. In that moment of profound humiliation, the laughing lightness of youth finally died. He realized that the staff officer was not a sedentary administrator, but the vital, invisible lubricant of the entire military machine. To be a professional was to embrace the bloody nuisance of the ledger with the same fervor as the Bren gun. The opinionated subaltern was gone, replaced by a technician of war who understood that the difference between victory and annihilation lay in the meticulous charging of a battery and the synchronization of a watch. This hard-won professionalism would soon be put to the ultimate test against an enemy that did not follow the rules of the desert. The failure of traditional road-bound tactics against the Japanese had left the British Indian Command with a choice: evolve or be extinguished. By 1944, the answer manifested in the radical, leopard-like spirit of long-range penetration, known as the Chindit experiment. This was no longer the army of the frontier outpost. It was a sprawling, air-dependent machine designed to bypass the impenetrable jungle by flying over it. At the center of this transition was the ground control office at Saiton, a high-tension nerve center that felt less like a military headquarters and more like the clinical interior of a ticking bomb. Inside, the air was a stagnant soup of humidity and cigarette smoke, vibrating with the rhythmic, mechanical pulse of a dozen synchronized chronometers. John Masters, the brigade major, stood amidst a sea of maps and cipher sheets, his world narrowed to the precision of a technician. There was no room for the laughing lightness of the old officer class here. Officers did not simply check their watches, they performed a ritualistic synchronization to air time, a singular, unforgiving temporal reality that governed the lives of thousands. The directive was absolute and chilling, stamped in bold across every operational document: destroy before emplanement. This was not merely a security precaution, it was a psychological severance. To step onto that airfield was to leave the world of paper, rank, and safety behind, entering a vacuum where the only reality was the mission. The transition from the frantic administrative heat of Saiton to the tarmac was a descent into a mechanical underworld. The night of March 5, 1944, was thick with the smell of high-octane aviation fuel and the earthy, rotting scent of the jungle edge. Long, ghostly rows of C-47 transports sat waiting, their engines coughing into life with a roar that seemed to tear the humid air into strips. As the men of the British and Indian infantry moved toward the dark moors of the plains, they were no longer a collection of individuals, they were a column of overloaded herons, burdened by 80-pound packs, Bren guns, and the silent weight of the unknown. Inside the fuselage, the atmosphere was a jarring montage of sensory extremes. The hollow and decisive thud of the cargo doors closing signaled the end of the colonial era. As the planes lurched into the sky, climbing over the pearly grey sea of the mountain mist, a profound, heavy silence settled over the troops. This was the silent flight, a transit through enemy-held airspace where the roar of the engines became a mere background hum to the internal, unblinking stare of the men. They sat in the dim, red glow of the cabin lights, watching the dark, jagged spine of the Burmese interior slide beneath them. The crossing of the threshold into enemy territory was marked by the sudden, absolute implementation of signal silence. It was a tactical necessity that functioned as a psychological guillotine, decapitating the brigade from its rear headquarters and leaving it to drift in a vacuum of isolation. In the cockpit and the cabin, the radio headsets, once a source of constant crackling reassurance, fell dead. This silence was not a lack of sound, but a presence, a bladder-knotting tension that grew with every mile flown deeper into the Japanese-held jungle. The men were now pawns in an Olympian game, isolated cells within a living organism that had been flung into the dark. There was no calling for help to the high command and no bureaucratic safety net to catch them. Every man understood that if a plane spiraled into the teak forests below, the protocol was as clinical as the synchronization of their watches. They would burn the wreckage, march to the rendezvous, and report for duty. As the green jump lights finally flickered to life, casting a sickly emerald glare over the sweat-streaked faces of the Gurkhas and the Scots, the administrative discipline of the training camps met the raw, fragmented reality of the mission. They stepped out into the black void, falling toward a glowing rectangle of firelight carved into the hostile wilderness. They left behind the last vestiges of the old world for a war defined by the absolute, terrifying silence of the deep interior. But the fluid mobility of this dream died the moment the brigade was ordered to stop moving and start digging. This was the static block trap, a strategic pivot demanded by the rigid command of General Joe Stilwell, who viewed the jungle as a place to grind the enemy and his own allies into the dirt. Now we return to the mud and the screaming of the Blackpool block at Namkwin. By May 1944, the world had narrowed to a grey-green blur of slurry and the rhythmic, terrifying crump of Japanese 155mm heavy artillery. The umbilical cord of the airstrip was already a graveyard of charred aluminum. The hold at all costs directive from distant headquarters had become a clinical death sentence. Inside the perimeter, the distinction between a soldier and a foundered beast had evaporated. The men had long since passed the 80-day threshold of human physiological endurance. They were skeletal figures, with skin the color of clay, their eyes fixed in that hollow, unblinking Aleutian stare. Every breath was a struggle against the heavy, sweet stench of gangrene and the smell of uncleaned latrines overflowing in the monsoon rain. Jack Masters, the officer holding the crumbling line, watched as his 3-inch mortars hissed with steam as the barrels overheated. They were firing 1,600 pounds of ammunition every minute into the encroaching dark. The Japanese were not just attacking, they were systematically dismantling the hill with heavy shells that turned the teak forest into a splintered wasteland. Tensions peaked during a cinematic nightmare of friendly fire, as Allied fighter bombers dove through the mist to drop their loads so close to the wire that the heat of the explosions singed the hair on the defenders' arms. The breaking point arrived on the night of May 23rd. The aching refrain of command finally snapped. Masters looked at his men staggering through the knee-deep mud, their hands trembling so violently they could barely slot a magazine into their rifles. To stay was to witness a massacre for the sake of a map coordinate that General Stilwell's diary dismissed with a callous hope that the ordeal would burn up his allies. Could any commander justify such a sacrifice? Masters made the decision that would define his life. He would prioritize the 2,000 living souls over the political honor of a static defense.
The order was given to spike the guns and melt into the jungle.
The withdrawal was not a parade. It was a frieze of stumbling figures moving in a cosmic slow motion through the mud. It was marked by the ignoble joy of simply being alive, a primal relief that was immediately poisoned by the most harrowing cost of the campaign. 19 men, their bodies too shattered by shells to be carried through the mountain passes, had to be left behind. There was no medical miracle available, only the agonizing reality of a commander choosing the survival of the many over the mercy of the few. As the clack of Japanese bullets began to find the rear guard, the brigade moved north, a column of ghosts leaving their humanity in the waterlogged pits of Blackpool. By the time they reached the safety of the hills on June 1st, the physical collapse was absolute. Men who had once been the elite of the army now barked like dogs in their sleep, or stared at their rotting feet in a silent, catatonic trance. They had survived the trap, but as they looked back toward the valley, They knew that the glamorous myth of the jungle commando had been permanently dissolved into the Burmese mud. It was replaced by the cold, mechanical finality of a war that had finally pushed them beyond the limits of the soul. Yet these foundered beasts did not simply fade away. They were the fuel for a new, terrifyingly efficient machine. By early 1945, the strategic focus shifted from the special warfare of the jungle depths to a massive tactical synthesis. Under the relentless, driving leadership of General Pete Reese, the army had finally matured into a sophisticated, independent weapon. The old colonial illusions were long dead, replaced by a thunderous yellow tunnel of dust that followed the advance of the 19th Division. This was integrated warfare at its peak. Sherman tanks of the cavalry clattered alongside infantry, who marched until their boots were fused to their feet by sweat and grime. When the tanks bobbed down in the irrigation canals of the dry zone, there was no waiting for engineers. The men simply drove 3-ton trucks into the water to serve as makeshift bridges. The engines roared and the metal groaned as the armor rolled over them, signaling the birth of a professional force that would finally break the back of the enemy. The payoff for 6 years of grueling maturation finally arrived in the monsoon-soaked floodplains of the Sitang River. A massive Japanese army, shattered and starving, attempted a desperate breakout from the hills toward the east. What followed was not a battle in the traditional sense, but a clinical, systematic annihilation. The Indian Army was now a sharpened sword in the hand of the 14th Army, utilizing a high-velocity mesh of artillery and secret intelligence reports that pinpointed every truck and every officer. As the Japanese attempted to cross the swollen, mud-choked river on rafts of bamboo and oil drums, they were met by a slaughter of industrial proportions. The air was thick with the stammering roar of automatic weapons and the orange flashes of tank guns reflecting in the rising floodwaters. By the time the firing stopped, 11,500 Japanese lay dead in the mire. The 14th Army had lost only 96 men. The professionalization was complete. The Indian soldier was no longer a colonial auxiliary. He was the architect of the most lopsided victory in the history of the theatre. But for the men who had survived the Green Nightmare, the end of the war did not arrive with a parade. It arrived with a jarring, existential silence. In August 1945, John Masters and his wife Barbara sought refuge from the psychic weight of the conflict in the high, thin air of the Himalayas. They moved through the mountains like ghosts, navigating passes where the air was so brittle it felt like glass in the lungs. At 17,000 feet, near a towering, icy wall of stone, they encountered a silent black pool littered with the ancient sun-bleached bones and leather sandals of pilgrims who had simply sat down to die. The oppression of the battlefield seemed to cling even to these heights, a reminder that death was the only permanent resident of the wilderness. They lived on lentil stew and the sharp, clean scent of pines, listening to the soaring sound of a leopard in the valley below while trying to wash the smell of cordite from their souls. The final moment of this maturation occurred in the small mountain village of Joshimath. After weeks of isolation, the couple descended from the high passes with their skin chapped red and their eyes raw from the mountain glare. They entered a small room, a sudden, jarring island of civilization amidst the crags. There, on a table, lay a crumpled, weeks-old newspaper. The headline did not speak of the 14th Army or the fall of Rangoon. It spoke of Hiroshima. The realization hit with the force of a physical blow. The factory of war, the mechanical world of operation orders, C-47 supply drops, and the organizational tables that had governed their lives for 6 years had been rendered obsolete in a single, blinding flash of atomic fire. Masters felt a profound numbness, a creeping sense of madness, as he realized he was among the last on Earth to know the world had changed forever. The 10-ton bombs of the Royal Air Force, once the pinnacle of destruction, were now toys. The professional identity he had forged in the fires of the Burma jungle was now a relic. A holy man offered a blessing, "May God bless you in peace." But as they stood in that quiet room in Joshimath, the peace felt like a hollow, terrifying vacuum. The legacy of this transformation was the death of the 4th Gurkha Rifles as a colonial entity. The regiment that had once toasted the king in the satin-draped messes of the frontier was being reincarnated into the new Indian Republic. This transition was marked by the indistinguishable blood spilled by Naga, Sikh, and Gurkha alike. The social hierarchies of 1939 had been burned away, leaving behind an independent, proud force that had won its own freedom in the mud of the jungle and the dust of Mandalay. Yet, For the survivors, the psychic haunting remained a permanent layer of consciousness. The war was no longer an event. It was a restless search for connection in a world that had moved from the neat set piece to the shadow of the mushroom cloud. As they walked back out into the Himalayan night, the two moons of the war, the one of memory and the one of the future, shone over the landscape. The only remaining sound was the wind moving through the pines. It was a cold, mechanical finality that signaled the end of the imperial dream and the birth of a terrifying new age. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories. And please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.